block, and really good stuff in there, and a lot of kudos are coming through in the chat. So now we'll move on to a presentation from Jason Taylor, a landscape ecologist and director of the Aldo Leopold Wilderness Research Institute. Teresa Hollingsworth, the deputy director, was originally kind of a co-presenter on this and can't make it today. So I'm going to end up standing in for a few slides as well. And so without further ado, we have a half hour. We'll try to get through the presentation on the science planning and then have some time for discussion. So I'll pass it off to Jason and we'll get things kicked off.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. So I've got the host disabled participant screen sharing.
So Randy will get that figured out
Just
for you.
one second.
And yeah, we'll get this queued up, folks. And
good to go.
Right. Something's happening. Let's see.
All right. Seeing that once you get your full screen shared. Yep, perfect. Seeing just slides. Oh, I'm seeing your notes on the right, actually. So you might want to.
Okay, hold on a minute. There's a way to swap this, right?
Is I think maybe display settings.
Display settings at the top of your screen.
Display settings. Help me out. Where do I see display settings?
To the right above.
Top of the screen.
Yeah, like next to the show task.
I got it. It's hidden behind the. Got it.
We'll swap presenter view and yeah, that should do it. There you go. Yep, all good to go.
Okay, which puts everything in kind of an awkward place, but here we go. We'll make it work. Okay, so just greetings everybody from Missoula, Montana, and if you're in Western Montana, I'm happy to be here. It was windy last night, and I thought maybe I'd end up in North Dakota or something, but I'm here. We're all here, except for Teresa. Teresa couldn't make it today, as Chris was mentioning, so Chris is going to stand in and talk about the science portion of this process, and we'll just make our way through this together and do the best we can. So we'll start with, just in case there are people that are new to, or the Leopold Institute is new to some at the meeting today, I'll provide a brief overview of the Institute and science charters in particular, and I'll discuss the first few steps of the planning process and we'll share some initial results, right? And we're going to try to share the work that we've done over the last, say, 9 months in just a few minutes and leave some time for questions. So it's going to be a whirlwind tour. We'll do our best to bring everybody along and just up to speed on what we've done over the last, like I said, 9 months. So again, if the Leopold Institute is new to you, it's worth knowing that we're a national interagency federal research facility located on campus at the University of Montana. And while I know it's certainly true that people elsewhere, and many of you at the workshop this week, conduct wilderness relevant science, we are the only federal research group or institution in the United States that's wholly dedicated to science to support wilderness stewardship. And our purpose is advancing wilderness stewardship through transformational science. Science is what we do. And the Institute was established in 1993. Its precursor was a wilderness research management unit, which was established by the Forest Service in 1967, just after passing of the Wilderness Act. So I'll say a little bit more here about governance. It's important to know that in 1994, so the year just after about the same time that the Institute was formed, there was an interagency agreement signed by the Forest Service, the BLM, the Fish and Wildlife Service, and the National Park Service, and at the time, the National Biological Survey, which is now the USGS, which recognized the value of cooperating in development of efficient and effective wilderness research opportunities. And so this interagency agreement, which formalized the Institute as an interagency entity. So instead of, yes, we are a Forest Service shop, but we're also a BLM shop and a Fish and Wildlife Service shop and a National Park Service shop. So we're working collaboratively because it's the right thing to do, and also because we have an interagency agreement that says we will. So in addition to being administered by the Rocky Mountain Research Station within Forest Service R&D, We are also responsive to an interagency wilderness policy council and participate as a member of an interagency wilderness steering committee. All of this toward ensuring the work we do is relevant to wilderness stewards on the ground. Okay, when I say Wilderness Research Institute, I mean federally designated wilderness, units of the National Wilderness Preservation System, right? So managed by those 4 agencies just mentioned across 2 departments, United States departments. So all 111 million acres and 800 units and many, many hundreds of managers and other stewards of wilderness. It's a nearly impossible task to try to cover with a small team, but we do our best. And this is why science planning efforts like we're going to talk about today are really important. Where are the highest priority needs? Where can we best put our capacity to do the most good? So speaking of our team, it's a relatively small but mighty team. Social scientists, biologists, and ecologists, and just call off a few people here. You met Chris Armitage just recently, a conservation social scientist. Kelly Kareem, brand new to our team. She's an aquatic ecologist, the first aquatic ecologist in the history of the Leopold Institute. So that's good news. We have high hopes for what Kelly can contribute in the near future. We've just hired a diversity, equity, and inclusion research scientist. That's Smokey Bear there in the center. It says vacant, but we'll have a new scientist joining the team in early December, and I'll share her information with you when it's appropriate to in the next couple weeks. Sean Parks is a fire and climate ecologist, and then Kathy Zeller, who's a wildlife biologist and landscape ecologist. And of course, we have emeritus staff and support staff, the admin team. Again, we do a lot of work for a relatively small team. It's a fantastic team, and I'm super happy to be a part of it. And one other thing about the team, it's worth noting that over the last 5 years or so, and many of you will know this, we've had, I keep saying over 60 years of experience retire, but I think it's probably closer to over 80 years of experience retire. And so we're in this kind of renewal or revival phase of the Institute. Most of us are new within the last 3 years, and we're just finding our way forward. Another reason why science planning is super important. And before leaving the slide, it's worth noting that we commonly host postdocs and students and visiting scholars. So if you're interested in participating with the work that we do or spending some time at Alry, please reach out. Happy to have a conversation. And similarly, speaking of visiting scholars, we have a rich history of hosting international collaborations and scholars and fellows. So again, if you're interested in spending some time here and you're watching from overseas, we're always interested in making new friends and developing new partnerships. Okay, so this is our last kind of introduction slide, and it's just this notion about what's the scope of our work, what's the kind of work we do, and I'm going to stay at a very high level here. It really fits into 3 bins. And I say today because this has been the scope of our work, broadly speaking, since 2008, since the last charter was developed. Science for wilderness, wilderness for science, wilderness for landscape sustainability. So the science for wilderness piece, kind of the bread and butter, it's like conducting science to help managers more effectively steward wilderness. That has been historically our priority and will continue to be our priority going forward. There's also this wilderness for science piece, so thinking about wilderness areas as scientific laboratories, if you will, for understanding baseline conditions and to more effectively or in a different way understanding changes that we're seeing outside of wilderness areas by studying systems within wilderness areas. And then wilderness for landscape sustainability. We know the impacts of wilderness basically flow outside the boundaries of wilderness areas, and there's an influence there, and it's important for us to study those impacts. How does wilderness matter outside of wilderness? Okay, so what we're here to actually talk about today. So the Leopold Institute is kind of in the midst of a fairly significant administrative process. Again, something that happens only roughly every decade. And it's basically, it is developing our next science strategic plan, or in Forest Service R&D language, science charter, so our science charter. And so Forest Service research and development units operate on charters, and it defines the sideboards of the work, and it explicitly establishes the commitments that we're making to the wilderness research community. These are the kinds of questions that we're going to try to answer over the next decade. Our first charter was signed in 1993, then in 2008. The current charter expires in September of 2022, so about a year from now. So we're working our way through getting the new charter prepared. It's also worth noting that we are sending a first final draft of that new charter to the Interagency Wilderness Steering Committee later this week. And so we've made a significant level of progress on that. That's kind of what we hope to get you up to speed on, how we've come to where we are now and over the next 20 minutes. So the other thing I wanted to mention is that we've been very deliberate to move forward in a kind of a partner, from a partner engagement stance, I guess. So that is to take as much input as we can from the people on the ground, from all of you, to understand where your needs are, to make sure that the work we're doing ultimately matters, again, to stewardship on the ground. And then in turn, we'll end up in the end, we'll just touch on this at the end today, we'll cross those needs, the broad identified needs, with the capacity and expertise that we have at the Institute, to really hone in on those things that we can commit to over the next 5 to 10 years. Okay, so how do we start this science planning effort? And we're just going to walk you through in a stepwise fashion for kind of what we did over the last 9 months. And we started with this list of, or we called it a universe of potential research questions. And so Chris in particular spent a bunch of time looking at previous science planning efforts and literature, and looked back to whatever writings and conversations he had collected from Institute scientists and staff over the decades, and developed this universe of potential research questions. And it's called the research concourse in this Q terminology, which Chris will get into a bit more later. But we started this exercise with a list of 178 research questions. That's the list that we came up with. But we knew from the very beginning that it was at very least incomplete. And so this is where we look to all of you, our first step in partner engagement. So we sent an opportunity for input or engagements to 160 people, mailing lists, and organizations. And so heavy on mailing lists and organizations. So 160 individual addresses. It went to many hundreds of people from there. And so agencies and tribes and NGOs and universities and other interested publics within the United States and globally. And again, in turn, those people forwarded the request for input to all of their networks. Many of you did that for us, and we appreciate that. And just one very quick example is sharing the request for input with the IUCN World Commission on Protected Areas Wilderness Specialist Group, right? And the Wilderness Specialist Group then forwarded that request for input out broadly within the WCPA. And the second step, which Chris will talk about in more detail, was actually sent to the entire World Commission on Protected Areas mailing list. And so we had a fair bit of national and international engagement. And thank you for all of that input. And so we developed some tools to help facilitate this process. And so Josh Gage, we work with Josh Gage Cartographics, and he helped us build some tools to allow this kind of interaction between us and you in a virtual environment. So this is just a screenshot of the first tool that was developed. It was provided an opportunity again for all of you to provide feedback on the research concourse. Do we have all the questions that we need? Are questions missing? Do we miss the boat on a particular question? What are the nuances that we need to understand? And just asked all of you to flesh out this potential list of research needs or the concourse, and you responded, and thank you for the response. And so that initial opportunity for input, from that initial opportunity for input, the web application was visited 232 times. We received 117 comments and suggestions from people across 31 states and DC, and we had 24 international visitors and 8 of those visitors, international folks, commented. So this partner engagement step pushed the list of potential research needs to well over 200 questions. So what do you do with 200 questions? It's fairly intractable, right? And so the next step in this process is to distill the concourse. And so into something called a Q set, which is a tractable set of statements that broadly represent the ideas in the concourse. And so our exercise or the real work there was trying to figure out how to distill 200 plus questions into something that was more digestible. And Chris and Teresa get most of the credit here. They did a ton of work to make this happen, and they ended up distilling the 200 research questions into 31 integrated research topics. And I know this is small text and it's just meant to just be a cue for understanding. These are the 31 integrated research topics, and they're things like wilderness as a control, diversity, equity, and inclusion, technology and wilderness partnerships, ecological interventions, user conflicts, continuing inventory and monitoring support, biodiversity conservation, cumulative impacts, wild and scenic rivers, the influence of definitions and language on wilderness management. So there's a broad range of integrated research topics, and the next step was then to figure out where are the priorities. There's 31, still too many, right? So what are the highest priorities? What are the highest priority needs from you, the wilderness stewards? And so again, we went out to that same broad group of partners, again, nationally and internationally, and invited everyone to prioritize these 31 integrated research topics based not on what they thought was necessarily right or wrong, but based very explicitly on their research needs on the ground, in whatever units or whatever level they're kind of intersecting with wilderness stewardship. And we did that using another web application. And I'm going to pass it here to Chris, who's going to take us through the kind of the detailed nuances of the data and the science.
All right, thanks, Jason. And so, yeah, once we had those 31 integrated research topics, we, invited people to engage with this prioritization. So this is just a screenshot of what you'd see when you clicked on the link, and it kind of highlights the steps you need to go through. And so I'll go through those really quickly here. And so next slide. And so the crux of the issue is kind of forcing people to make trade-offs, really, right? We understand that all these 31 integrated research topics, from diversity, equity, inclusion to the wilderness experience to disturbance in wilderness, are really important, but we can't answer them all in full go, as Jason kind of got into. We've got, expertise constraints, there's broader funding constraints, et cetera. And so we kind of wanted people to put on the prioritization hat like we need to do for this planning charter process. And so folks had to prioritize research topics along this distribution. You had to pick your kind of 2 highest priorities in the +4. So it's important to note columns denote the different values, but the rows do not. So you get like 2 +4 priorities, your 2 highest priorities, and then your next 3, and then your next 4, and so on until you fill that whole broad, that whole distribution out. And so you have to kind of, in the end, you got to pick 2 that are your lowest priority. And so we had everybody do that. And so next slide. How many folks did we have do that? In total, 175 respondents engaged with that prioritization exercise and completed it fully. And so here's just a really quick breakdown of where those folks kind of come from. We had people in a variety of roles, but these are the affiliations. We've got MPS, BLM, Fish and Wildlife Service, the Forest Services are the 4 major land management agencies, of course. And then we've got some good participation from tribes and university, as well as others and NGOs and private citizens, interested folks, et cetera. Okay. And then after we did that, I'll show you the results here in a minute. But what we did is, once we had the results from this work, we did a follow-up workshop. So really what you didn't get through that prioritization exercise, right, is an understanding of what underpins that. Why is the wilderness experience topic your most important? Or why is climate change your most important? Or whoever those people are, we wanted to kind of understand what underpins that. Is it some struggle in the field? Is it existential threat of, threatening humanity? Is it wilderness is changing? All these ideas, right? We wanted to get some kind of conversational data layered into that. And we don't really present much of that today, but we will in a forthcoming, hopefully, publication. And so we really asked folks in these 5 workshops about kind of those prioritizations to understand the nuance, you know. Do they resonate with you? That was part of it, right? We wanted to make sure we're capturing the diverse voices in the room. And then why do those perspectives resonate with you? And, you know, what might you name those perspectives? And so we did that. So next slide. And then with that, we kind of evaluated the overall body of knowledge that we got in a couple of ways. We looked at really just the raw scores. So like aggregate responses. So we had 175 people do the prioritization, right? What were the highest average values, for instance, just to kind of see in the range of values, and then most importantly, perhaps, which I'll speak to in a minute. And then we really looked at kind of, as the slide says, the real power of Q methodology is looking at the diverse range of perspectives in the room. So if you have 175 people do that, you're probably going to have these different threads of discourse, these different shared perspectives, if you will. Unlikely are all 175 going to agree that resource priorities are the same, right? So you end up finding clumpings and groups of folks who kind of feel the same way. And that's really the power and the focus of the analysis, which I'll get into in a minute. So I don't talk at all about the analyses, but if you know, technically that is the statistics, but if you're interested, feel free to reach out offline. And so what we have here is these kind of just overall aggregate. And what you see is, you know, biodiversity conservation is the top there, and we'll push those out here in a minute just so you can see them. But the real important thing to take away from this slide mostly is the max and min. So what this tells us is we have 175 people do it. Every integrated research topic was the highest priority for somebody or the lowest priority for somebody. So you get full variation across those research topics. So it just goes to show, well, one, how hard the job is of doing this planning, right? It's like you've got all these people who think, no, this is the highest priority. No, this is the highest priority. No, it's this one, right? So you have the full variation. So it does kind of distilling that and starting to factor analyze and figure out these different perspectives is really important. But again, also just curious to know and think about the different roles of people we have in the room, what kind of goes to the top. And so I think next slide, some will pop up here, Jason, right? We saw these 4 kind of coming off, or these 5, excuse me, were the top research priorities. So wilderness for biodiversity conservation, ecological interventions, effects of climate, integration of multiple knowledge and value systems, and disturbance in wilderness. So those are the top 5. But again, it's really clear to say on average, right? So if we just average everybody, those were the ones that rose to the top. And it's also important to note that this sample is not quote unquote random. So it's, you just kind of be cautious with that little bit of knowledge. The full variation is most important. We weren't really interested in, putting too much stock in the overall aggregates. And then, so we're losing a little bit here, cut off the bottom, but the idea was to take those 175. We really wanted to look across roles. That's kind of what these graphics are showing. What did policymakers feel, or managers or scientists? You know, did we see any trends there? And then we moved on really to the important part, or the most highest kind of salient part, which is these different perspectives. And Jason can move on to that, the first one here now. And just to give you an idea, so there's going to be 3 of these that I'll run through really fast and then pass it off to Jason. But we had 3 perspectives that came out of the 175 that explained a lot of that variation. So essentially, you can't look at everybody's different sorting, right? So where were the trends, or where were the shared perspectives? And factor analysis is going to give you those. And so we have 3 of them. And this is the societal. We had societal, managerial, and environmental is kind of what we named them as, or ecological, I think. And so here you see the colors are just to draw your kind of attention to the high priorities. The green is the +2, 3, 4. Dark green is +3 and 4. Blue is kind of the lower priority. For this group, for people who aligned with this perspective, you can see experience and visitor preferences, the influence of views on nature, understanding ecosystem free from human effects. And on the flip side, you've got some of the definitions in language, translating wilderness research. I'm going to move quickly to the next one because I do see we're running out of time. And then this one's very ecologically focused. Wilderness for biodiversity conservation, climate change, disturbance, right? A lot of what you'd expect kind of an environmentally focused research questions and topics, even though there's social facets to all of these, of course. And then the last one is managerial. And you're really, these are probably the questions plaguing managers the most, because we did find the managers loaded onto this in large part, but it makes sense, right? Ecological interventions, mitigating and restoring ecological resources, supporting inventory and monitoring, effectiveness of stewardship. You're making these decisions out there. Are they working or not? Right. So this was kind of a shared perspective, really focusing on some of those managerial impacts and decisions. And so I'll just move quickly through that. That's all we have time for, really. We don't have time to dive into the weeds. And so what did we do with all this? How did we integrate it into our science plan? Jason?
Yeah, thanks, Chris. And so the next, there's just a couple more slides here, and it's, what do we do, as Chris said, with all of the information? And so there was we'll call it a management decision at some point along the way that recognized that if we took the top 5 research priorities from each of the 3 different perspectives, so those managerial, ecological, and societal, take the top 5 from each of those, also take the top 5, excuse me, priorities from the input from the management agencies and the tribes, the on average, kind of the raw data. We take the 5, 5, 5, 5, and overlay those, you end up with 15 top priorities. And so this is basically what we heard from all of you, like through this process of public engagement and filtering and distilling and the discourse, the conversations that we had at the workshops. What we think we heard from you, based upon all of that, is that these are the top 15 priorities that we should consider as we're developing our next science plan. So wilderness for biodiversity conservation, ecological interventions, effects of climate change, integration of multiple knowledge systems, disturbance in wilderness, approaches to mitigate and restore ecological resources, evaluating the effectiveness of stewardship, actions supporting inventory and monitoring, wilderness for critical life support systems, wilderness to understand ecosystem resources, trends in wilderness use, diversity, equity, and inclusion in wilderness, opportunity challenges of special provisions, the influence of wilderness on people's view of nature, and the wilderness experience. And so those are the top 15, right? That's basically a summary of all the work to date. Those are the top 15 that we heard from you. And so the question is, what do we do with that? What's our next step? So the next step is to determine which of those top 15 priorities we can actually address as an institute. And both from an expertise standpoint and from a capacity standpoint. Again, we have 5 research grade scientists, and so there's only so much we can accomplish. And so the conceptual figure that's on the screen right now is derived actually from data, right? It's derived from those data that were collected as part of the Q-sort process, and provides an indication of where we're headed. And that is, we are proposing, I guess is a better way to say it, 5 research priority areas. We'll propose those to the Wilderness Steering Committee and to Forest Service Research and Development. And those 5 research priority areas are heavily influenced by partner priorities and perspectives that came out of the Q methodology process. For example, biodiversity conservation, climate change, effectiveness of stewardship decisions, use, relevancy, and inclusivity, harmonizing multiple knowledge systems, and co-production. Those are examples of the kind of things where the priorities might lie. And it's worth noting that the width of the lines here indicate the importance of each perspective. So it's an attempt to try to demonstrate that we took the input from all the perspectives and the input from the partners, which you can't see. As Chris said, that I'm realizing for some reason all of these slides are cut off. So the bottom row is the list of partners: BLM, Fish, Parks, Forest Service, Tribal, University, and other. And so it's just attempting to demonstrate we've done our best to identify research priority areas that speak to the needs of all of our partners from different angles, if you will. And so that's kind of where the story ends for today. And we have progressed into identifying these research priority areas. And as I mentioned, we'll be presenting those to the Interagency Wilderness Steering Committee later this week. And we are most definitely looking forward to sharing the results of these additional steps and a completed charter a completed charter for the next decade of our work at a future National Wilderness Workshop. So I'll end there, and Chris, hand it back to you as the moderator versus a presenter. So thank you.
Thanks, Jason. Moderator hat back on. And so we are at the middle of the hour, I guess. And so we do have a break here. I can't speak for Jason, but I have a bit of time, so I can hang around if there's some questions, if others want to. If you got to go, thanks for being here. Sorry, we don't have a bunch of more time, but there is one question. It seems there's only one open question. And it's from Bill Hodge. Have you been able to see if there are other partners that might be doing priority area work so you can move to another priority? I'll pass that to Jason. It's a real good question though, Bill, and something we've talked about, meaning like, yeah, don't be redundant. Exactly. And so, Jason, thoughts?
Yeah, well, I think Chris answered it. So we haven't gone through an explicit process to ensure we're not being redundant, but each of the scientists who are all experts in their field are weighing in heavily on the research questions that are proposed in the charter. And therefore, I hate to say I hope, but I guess that's the best way I can answer this question. I hope have taken into account their knowledge of the current knowledge of the field. And so, and then that's also in part of, as we push this out to the Interagency Wilderness Steering Committee and a Forest Service R&D more broadly, there's going to be an opportunity for people to weigh in. So Bill, there has not been an explicit process to validate that we're not cross-pollinating or duplicating others' work, but it's kind of inherent in the process that we're following.
Great. I'm not seeing any other open questions, but some good kudos. So thanks for that. Seems as if there were some ideas for how to fix the screen issue. So hopefully for next presentation, there's some learning going on there. Yeah.
So I'm not able to ask questions as the host, but I have one.
All right.
And I'm just curious how I'm not able to type them in. Anyways, what sort of coordination is the Leopold Institute doing with other university researchers to kind of share the load and coordinate the implementation of these priorities across the whole spectrum of possible researchers?
Yeah. Go ahead, Jason.
Yeah, I have two quick thoughts. One, again, we have a fairly robust relationship, I think, across the university system with the scientists and others doing wilderness research. We also had a fairly robust response from university partners and collaborators around the country and really around the globe, and input into helping us sort out what the research questions might be and what the priorities for topics should be. And so we have that, and then this is just as a little bit of a projection, Randy, and that is, I don't know that we do that well enough yet, and that's not a dig at any one person. As an institute, this limited capacity thing is just like everyone else, is hard to deal with. We have a significant, in my mind, a significant priority for us is hiring a science delivery specialist. Someone whose job it will be day in and day out to work with our partners to understand their stewardship needs, to understand their science questions, to not only make sure we're connecting the knowledge we're developing with the need that they have, but also looking well beyond the halls and walls of the Leopold Institute to understand all of the wilderness science that's being conducted, at least nationally, if not internationally, and building bridges and making connections. And so I would say we have a fairly robust engagement with university partners now, but it's not enough. And as soon as we get the capacity in the house to facilitate those relationships, we will be reaching out more aggressively and more thoroughly. I hope that answers your question.
It does. Thank you.
Sure.
Thanks, Jason. And I'm not seeing anything else in the chat. Some kudos. People appreciate. Thank you for transparently sharing the process. So some reinforcement of the process and the appreciation of that. And no other open questions. And I recognize we're 4 minutes past the slot, and there's a break time before the next group of presentations. So I'll leave it to you to close that out, Randy. Otherwise, thanks again for everybody.
Yeah, thank you.